I'm Mike Bowen. I'm a co-author of the book We Found the Lost Sand Creek Site that details the discovery of the real location of Black Kettle's village and the Sand Creek running battle areas. And this discovery was made by my dad, Chuck Bowen, with the assistance of my mom, his wife, Sherry Bowen. And I'm going to talk today about the issue of combatants at Sand Creek. And this is a topic that doesn't generally get discussed when it comes to Sand Creek because most people just simply believe that all of the combatants at Sand Creek were soldiers, and that they believed because of this massacre claim that all of the soldiers they ran around the village and they killed all the Indians as they awoke and came up out of their teepees, and none of the Indians could have been combatants because they were just picked off as they came out of their teepees. But how much of this is true? So we're going to dive into that this morning and enjoy this video. And we're going to talk about combatants at Sand Creek. So we almost need to understand this massacre claim. This massacre claim says all of these Indians were camped below a bluff that is at what is now the National Park Service Sand Creek site. And they were allegedly camped below this bluff. They were hidden below this bluff where they could not hear or see an approaching enemy, and they were all camped, congested in this small area below this bluff, and it just left them in a place where they were sitting ducks, where they could not defend themselves. And the massacre claim says that the Indians were also just this peaceful village, unarmed, and they had not committed any atrocities against any white settlers, and that the soldiers came along and just killed them all. And how much of that really is true? So let's look at combatants at Sand Creek. So we know there were soldiers at Sand Creek. There was approximately 700 soldiers between the Colorado 1st and the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. So we know soldiers were involved at Sand Creek, but there's also this idea and this notion that there were no warriors in the village at Sand Creek. They were all off hunting. We talk about this in blogs on our website and our written blogs that we encourage you to read, and we'll have some links to these blogs in the description on this video. But there's this belief and notion that the warriors were not in the camp. It was all that was there was these defenseless women, children, and elderly. But we learned something differently about warriors in Black Kettle's village, and one of the people we get a lot of information from is a man named George Bent. He was actually in Black Kettle's village at Sand Creek, and he actually lived among them as a dog soldier, also known as a warrior. So he was a warrior in Black Kettle's village, and he wrote letters to historians about 40 years after Sand Creek, answering the questions of historians about his time at Sand Creek and his life as a Cheyenne dog soldier. And George Bent was also half Cheyenne, so that played a role into him, living in Cheyenne villages as a dog soldier. He was half Cheyenne, and he was also was a soldier at the Civil War, fought in 4 Civil War battles as a Confederate, and so he saw the Union soldier as the enemy. So that's important context for George Bent. What we get a lot of information from George concerning his time at Sand Creek and time as a dog soldier, and he writes about that during the Sand Creek engagement that he ran 2.5 miles from the top of the village. He ran 2.5 miles up the creek from there to the rifle pits. And George said that at the rifle pits, that the men, he said the warriors fought off soldiers. He was talking about the dog soldiers. They fought off soldiers until the rifle pits were ready to get into. And he said one pit was actually big enough for 19 people to get into. And so he said that at this point there were warriors there fighting off soldiers so they could get into these rifle pits. And to get 19 people into just one of them, he talked about upper and lower rifle pits. And so it's important. George Bent says they ran. He probably, he means that he ran his horse 2.5 miles. So they got to these rifle pits, and they got into these rifle pits, but warriors were there fighting off the soldiers. So we know from George Bent that warriors were indeed in the village. In fact, we have over 400 pages of George Bent's letters to historians in our archives, and nowhere in those letters does he ever make a single claim that warriors were off hunting when they are at Sand Creek. He actually makes multiple claims of talking about different warriors who were there in the village, including himself, including Little Bear. Little Bear is the Indian warrior that went early that morning on November 29, 1864. He went across the creek, went up on a hill to go get his horse. And when he was doing this, he looked south toward the lodgepole trail and he saw a long black line. So he's the one that spotted the soldiers from miles away, and he went and then he alerted the Indians in the village, and then they started to flee. So we know that there were indeed warriors in the village. That's just simply for George Bent. He was one of them. He'd have no reason to lie about that information. So we know from George Bent warriors were there, and so we also know he said they fought off the Indians. And I mean, the Indian warriors fought off the soldiers, and so they were armed as well. That's the other part of that Sand Creek massacre claim, is that the Indians were all unarmed. So in kind of October time period, early November, the Indians were, they were going to camp over by Fort Lyon. Well, at that time, the commanding officer at Fort Lyon was Major Wynkoop, and it was his orders that the Indian had to relinquish their arms to camp at the fort. And Major Anthony assumed the command on the 2nd of November, 1864, and he had the same orders for the Indians, that they must give up their arms in order to camp there near Fort Lyon. And once they were done camping there, they would be able to get their arms back. And so Major Anthony had those orders for the Indians. And we know from eyewitness testimony from a man named Silas Sewell. Silas Sewell is the guy in the massacre camp that people think was a Sand Creek hero. They said he refused to fight. In fact, he never testified that he refused to fight. He actually testified about his concern for crossfire. But anyway, in Silas Sewell's testimony, he talked about that, and he asked under testimony, he said that yes, the Indians got their arms back. And how did he know this? Silas Sewell is the one that returned their arms to the Indians. That was per the orders of Major Anthony. And Silas Sewell returned the arms to the Indians. So he was saying, yes, he himself returned their arms. They were not unarmed. And it goes a little bit further than that. Silas Sewell also said that none of the dog soldiers, none of the warriors stopped to even relinquish their arms. They just kept going. They ignored the orders. So they never even were unarmed to begin with. So all the warriors were armed, had their arms the whole time, and they were indeed there at Sand Creek and armed. The rest of the Indians were armed. So for Silas Sewell, the Indians, the rest of them were also armed. So they had weapons with them. They had arrowheads, and we not only know from George Bent and from Silas Sewell, we know from artifacts. So part of the over 4,000 artifacts that my dad found at the Lost Sand Creek site include arrowheads, and they are actually metal arrowheads. By the 1860s, Indians were either making them out of the hoops on water barrels, or they were trading for them. And so they were using metal arrowheads at this point. And so he found quite a number of metal arrowheads, proving that Indian warriors were indeed in that camp. And also, we know from eyewitness testimony that Indians not only used bows and arrows, they also used guns. So gunfire wouldn't have just been from a soldier, gunfire would have also been from an Indian. They were armed with guns and bows and arrows. So they were indeed armed that day. And you can see our blog, our written blog about combatants at Sand Creek on our website. The link again will be in the video description here. Please check out that video before include all of the citations for this information. It's very, very important information, understanding Sand Creek and the truth about what happened that day. So yes, we know that warriors were indeed in the camp. They were armed. The Indians were armed. But other combatants wouldn't have just been warriors. Other combatants would have been also the Indian women. George Bent said that the Indian women did the hard work in the camp. They would skin and tan the hides. They would put up the lodges. They would do a lot of hard work in the camp. And again, that citation can be found in our written blog. And you can find more information about that. But George Bent talked about them doing a lot of the hard work in the camp. Also, Indian women, they hunted antelope, they hunted buffalo. George Bent talks about how the Cheyenne Indians would make antelope pits, and they would chase antelope into pits, and then they would get them in a pit where then the rest of the Indians could come out and make charge at the pit, and then clubs to death. And this wasn't just Indian warriors; this included everybody in the village. This was the whole family affair. That would be the warriors and the women and the children. They all participated in clubbing antelope to death. So the Indians were raising their children in these ways, teaching them how to hunt and kill. This is important to understand, and understanding Sand Creek, because that massacre claim says that they were all just these defenseless Indians, and they couldn't, basically fight their way out of a wet paper bag. But in reality is we have to understand Indian culture and white culture were a lot different. To be a soldier, you had to be 18 to be an Indian warrior. You could be a teenager and be an Indian warrior. And they were taught the use of a bow and arrow at a very young age. In fact, there's a captive. Her name was Sarah Larimer. She was captive and taken captive by Sioux Indians. And how this is important and how this ties into Cheyenne is George Bent said that Sioux and Cheyenne were one and the same, that they had lived together for over 100 years. Those two tribes were one and the same. The way they dealt with people was the same. And in fact, there probably was some Cheyenne mixed in with Sioux when Sarah Larimer was taken captive. And you can read more about her in our blog. And we learned from Sarah Larimer that she was basically um, being given this. She was offered this nice reward as while she was a captive. They're going to teach her the use of a bow and arrow, and she said their conversations were fully on killing, and she said their conversations were fully on destruction and killing. And she was really she was appalled by this. They're doing this in front of children, teaching them their ways as warriors, teaching the children at a very young age how to hunt and kill. And she was an eyewitness to that. And we know then that combatants at Sand Creek would have included soldiers, warriors, women, children, teenagers. They would have all been taught the use of a bow and arrow. They would have all been very good at using the bow and arrow, not just at Sand Creek, but any place they camped. And from Sand Creek soldiers, we learned that from firing distance, when people talk about how well women and children were targeted and killed at Sand Creek, actually we learned from eyewitnesses, including Irving Halbert and Lieutenant Templeton, that know that from firing distance, they could not tell the difference between a male and a female Indian. They were dressed the same. They looked the same. So from firing distance, they could not tell the difference. So yes, some women were just killed by accident simply for being mistaken as a man. And also any children that could have been killed, that also could have happened from exploding cannon shells. So that would have been the first thing that happened that day, because cannons are only effective when there's a large congested, part of the enemy congested together in a small area. You've got to have the enemy congested together for cannons to be effective. So while Indians were still fleeing the village, the first thing they had to really do, because they had a really short window of time, they just set up the cannons and they fired at fleeing Indians. And there's only been one location in the Lost Sand Creek site where it included cannonball shell fragments. And in fact, this is on the opposite side. It's not at the village. Very little fighting actually took place in the village. That's also important to understand with Sand Creek, is this was a running battle. There is no congested area where there is a village and fighting. The village is on one side of the creek, and actually the running battle area started on the opposite side of the creek from the village. And the village extended up for about 2 to 3 miles. And the running battle areas extended for several miles too. Also, and again, starting on the other side of the creek from the village, and then extending up the creek and going in different directions. It was truly a running battle. So the soldiers had a really short window to shoot those cannons. And so that is that was likely what would also happen for any women and children killed, because these were shot from about half mile away. And so from half a mile away, you really cannot tell the difference of anybody from that point. So you're just shooting at Indians. We have to understand, Sand Creek was not a random attack on a village of Indians. Sand Creek was based on the many requests and appeals for help from Colorado Territory Governor John Evans. He made many requests for help because Indian warriors were just terrorizing Colorado Territory, especially during the spring and summer of 1864. They were killing white settlers, taking captives, scalping their white enemies, running off and taking stock. They're causing just a tremendous amount, not just of damage, but destruction and death. And so this was not a random attack on a peaceful village. Sand Creek was an act of war. That's what we need to understand. Is Sand Creek was requested by General Curtis. So General Curtis gets these requests from Governor John Evans, and General Curtis acts and says, "Yeah, we must make the Indians suffer more." And also needs to be understood that at the Council of Camp Weld in September, before Sand Creek, that no, they did not agree to any terms of peace. In fact, John Evans said, "I cannot make terms of peace for you. My soldiers are getting ready for the fight." In fact, that is precisely what he said. and he warned them that they were preparing for a fight and they could not make peace with them. They were never given any protection under the flag. Those talks happened between Cheyenne leaders such as Black Kettle and um, Major Winecoop, who was the commanding officer at Fort Lyon, but he was removed from his post. He did not have the authority to even be talking about those terms of peace. He basically ignored the requests from his superior officers and went around them to try to make these terms, talk about terms of peace. He did not have that authority to do so. Governor Evans made it clear that was not going to happen, and General Curtis made it clear that was not going to happen. So, as we understand, combatants at Sand Creek, and as they went to Sand Creek, it was a fight, and they were going to fight warriors. They were not going out and singling out women and children. In fact, a lot of the women and children would have been combatants at Sand Creek. And there are times at Sand Creek, a soldier had to make a tough decision when they're even seeing a child, but the child is shooting arrows at them. Then, as we know now from Sarah Larimer, from other eyewitnesses, they learned that art at a very young age, and there's no doubt they were shooting arrows at soldiers that day. So, a soldier had to make a very difficult decision. Do I defend myself or my comrade, or do I let myself or my comrade get killed? It's no different, honestly, than today, than a sniper in Middle East having to make a decision. I see this child with a bomb strapped to him. Do I take out that child, or do I let that bomb take out 100 people or more? They had to make difficult decisions at Sand Creek as well. No children were not targeted, but there were times where they would have had to make that decision. Did I defend myself, or do I defend my comrade, or let my comrade or myself get killed? We have to look at this through a lens of 1864. We cannot look at it simply through a 2025 lens and try to judge it by today's standards. And also from firing distance, they didn't have the scopes and things like that on their guns. They couldn't see a long way away. They were, 200 yards sometimes, taking shots at Indians. And Indians also firing distance wasn't just the distance, from a soldier firing at an Indian warrior. Is also Indians shooting at soldiers. So firing distance goes both ways. And so they didn't have modern technology then. They couldn't see that far. They see Indians dressed the same. They look like warriors, and to them they're shooting at warriors. And in fact, there was a place at Sand Creek where Major Anthony, he was the commanding officer at the time of Sand Creek, and he went out with Shibington and the soldiers. And according to Major Anthony, an eyewitness, he said that he saw over 100 warriors where he was. So, and we have to understand this too, that we have to look at this from the whole. We'll have to look at everything. That at Sand Creek, we know from not just eyewitnesses, but we know from artifacts that Sand Creek extended for several miles. He's in just one small area of Sand Creek seeing 100 warriors, so we know there were even more than that. And there were skirmish areas my dad found that show a fight between a warrior and a soldier, and soldiers were also killed by warriors at Sand Creek. This was not a one-sided attack. This was not a an attack against a defenseless, peaceful village. These warriors were in the camp, and they'd have been out, the same warriors out actually just raiding and terrorizing Colorado Territory during the summer of 1864 and in the spring of that year as well. So we know from artifacts and eyewitnesses, combatants, they were not just soldiers. They were soldiers fighting warriors, and women and children and teenagers, and the Indians were also combatants at Sand Creek. I encourage you to go read more about this. Read about this in our blog with a little bit more information that I can just spell out here, all with our citations. And that link to that blog will be in the video description below. Make sure you give us a follow on Facebook, facebook.com/BowenHistory. Subscribe right here to us on YouTube. It's for free. There's no charge. Everything, you can watch everything for free. All of our videos on here. We have some short films that would probably be of interest to you. We have a short film about the Water Valley Schoolhouse. It was the last remaining building at the Water Valley town site and its importance to Sand Creek. So go look at these short films. We have a short film about James Carr and the letter he wrote about finding his friend and comrade Robert McFarland dead on the battlefield at Sand Creek. So look at that short film as well, and just check out the videos. We have some artifact and metal detecting videos on here as well. Check those out. Again, go check out our website, thelostsandcreek.com, and check out our blogs. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.